So I'm wondering whether we'll get started. I was playing this graphic that we identified during the planning for this session, and I think it was just to try and bring home a little bit of the topic of the discussion, and the context of this particular crisis that we find ourselves in, and the contagion, I suppose, that we're dealing with, and how the contagion is affecting all sorts of social structures and affecting multi-agency interactions probably, and also where multi-agency interactions might be used as a response. So given the significance of the crisis, it emerged in our planning to think maybe we should create a space for reflection, for some critical reflection about what's actually happening in this crisis. And we're so pleased to have 4 stalwarts of the CSSI community and high caliber academics, obviously in their own right as well, to offer some reflections. And again, like with other plenaries, you feel free to start your chat questions in the chat function. So we have Professors Sandra Waddock, Barbara Gray, Rob Van Tulder, and James Austin, who are going to form this panel. We're going to go straight into it because I don't want to lose the time for the meaty discussions I'm hoping that are going to come out of this. So we have our initial question, because what we were talking about when planning this was asking ourselves, what is it or what might it be about the specifics of this particular pandemic and the contagion that we're dealing with, somehow that might make it different or maybe more similar to other crises. So can we put it into its context of a pantheon of crises, and maybe ask ourselves, is there something different about this? Rob, do you want to start us off?
Yes, thanks, Annmarie, and really happy to be here also in these difficult times. I can only congratulate our American colleagues. You are first, make America first, but I don't think that is a challenge that you want to face. So sorry for that. My real sincere apologies for this joke maybe. But nevertheless, I think we are facing a systemic crisis, a systems crisis, and I was just looking also in the research that we're doing and say, comparing the financial crisis of 2008 and now with the corona crisis of 2020. And there are many, many issues that are comparable, but they are a little bit different also. But for me, the two are ways that I want to compare them is that actually the systems crisis becomes obvious, it becomes transparent, it becomes clear. And unfortunately, I have to tell you, there are a number of crises still coming up, and the climate crisis, the inequality crisis, and whatever. So my statement here would be, everything that we face now at the moment is actually a systemic crisis that is already long overdue in terms also of the fragility that we created. And I can talk to globalization and whatever. And then linking it to the topic of our association, it is the lack of understanding that we need to develop common pool goods, and you need to develop governance structures that we get things together and not turn around from the big issues, the complexity issues, the wicked problems, but actually try to address them. And you can only do that in terms of partnering, in terms of collaboration. So for me, the systems crisis is real, but actually it is a crisis of collaboration. And also then, and maybe the final word on this, collaboration doesn't come top down, or is also not coming only bottom up, it's somewhere in between. So we call it hybrid governance. So in a sense also, we are not really able to define how hybrid governance could be appealing also as, say, as a way out of this crisis, but I think we need it.
Thanks, Rob, for that opening. Sandra, do you want to maybe speak for yourself, what you think it is specific about this crisis, or?
Yeah, so I have a number of perspectives, but one of them is I recently wrote a blog, and I used one of my favorite songs is Leonard Cohen's Anthem. And in it, the lines, "There's a crack in everything, that's where the light gets in," came to me. So, I mean, I think we can, as people who are interested in cross-sector collaborations of various kinds, we can think about where is that crack coming for us. So when we think about why is this crisis different from others, several things come to mind. First of all, it has affected the entire world simultaneously, and no one anywhere is able to escape its effects. Secondly, it's highlighted, as Rob just pointed out, the systemic inequities and the flaws of the system. these trends were already there, problems were already there, but this crisis has brought them right out in front of everyone, so people are aware. We are more technologically connected, as we are evidencing right at this moment, than we have ever been in the world, and so possibilities emerge from that. Many more people recognize the issues of climate change and ecological consequences, and particularly the ways in which something like this pandemic sort of arose out of not treating the environment very well. And then, even before all the protests began just this last month in the United States, there were protests all around the world last year. I was in Chile for the Transformations 2019 conference in October, and protests just massively broke out there while we were there, making it even difficult to leave, and some people got stuck in various ways. And if you looked around the world, there were protests happening everywhere. So there is huge unrest among people, and this unrest provides a sense of the cracks. So this activism that's erupted provides an opportunity, because the only way, as Rob also pointed out, the only way that we can bring about the kind of transformations that's needed is by working collaboratively together, and that poses huge opportunity for us. I have a lot more to say about organizations that I'd like to talk about called Transformation Catalysts, but I will turn it over to whoever's next.
We'll have time to come back to that, I'm sure, as well. Barbara, do you want to come in and express a little bit for you what is the unique aspects perhaps of this crisis, or not?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this, Annmarie. I want to speak about the failure of meaning systems. And I'm coming at it from a paper that I'm working on with some other colleagues before COVID hit, and we were trying to talk about displacement, dissensus, and the third D, disruption. And so we were looking at that generally. So COVID obviously fits nicely into that framework. And one of the things that struck me was reading a work about Native Americans who basically lost their livelihoods. And what could we learn from that particular experience about this crisis or any disaster that occurs? And in that crisis, there was a whole meaning system, a whole culture built up around, a lifestyle of hunting. And when that meaning system collapses, there's no hope left. The system actually leaves one in a hopeless, helpless position. And so I think we can see parallels with COVID, because we had not anticipated, although there had been predictions about pandemics for many years, we've not taken our due diligence around climate change. So we shouldn't be surprised about these things, but nonetheless, our meaning systems didn't have the flexibility or the give or the ability to entertain this possibility, this prospect. We had a hint when the fires began in Australia, and people there were actually saying things like, we can't go on our summer vacations the way we used to. We're going to have to change our lifestyles. And those platitudes, so to speak, have been said, but we haven't been paying attention. So along comes COVID, and now our meaning structures have fallen apart. And we're going to get to a discussion in a minute, I think, about the failure of preparation for collaboration. So I'll hold those thoughts and just add that idea about the helplessness that comes when our meaning system collapses.
And lastly to you, Jim, if I may, your kind of immediate thoughts on the nature of the crisis.
I think my three wonderful colleagues have provided a really rich listing of sort of distinguishing characteristics for the pandemic. And they all are possible shapers of the collaboration dynamics going forth. Maybe my overlapping list would include the following. global scale transmission. Second, it's an omnipresent infector and therefore a common enemy. Third, everyone is affected and everyone is relevant to the solution. It's fatal, but there are different at-risk groups. It is novel, no cure, unknown epidemiological dynamics and huge knowledge bottlenecks. There's an unprepared response capacity and therefore shortages in supply chains and service bottlenecks. Urgency permeates all the efforts. And lastly, it's multidimensional. It's a health crisis, but with enormous, massive economic and social consequences. So I just add those as salient factors that may be affecting the collaboration dynamics.
Wonderful, thanks so much. That's really interesting, really interesting. And just to bring on that conversation then, because there's been some lovely seeds been sown there that we can draw on for the rest of the discussion, I think. But just come back to Rob on that systemic disruption. I suppose how our systems have been, maybe systems that were working in terms of towards the capitalist system that were functioning quite well, that are heavily disrupted, and then other systems that were maybe depleted and weren't working so well. So I'm just wondering, do you see this as a kind of a moment of reckoning or a moment of change in these systems, the ones that are broken, new ones can be developed, or what do you think is happening from that systemic point of view?
Well, in my short introduction, I refer to the financial crisis also as a sort of, call it a post-millennial tipping point where at least part of the world started to realize that maybe this globalization system didn't work the way we intended. And we, of course, is in the north because it never really worked very well for many poor people, except for, say, maybe 200 million Chinese that went out of poverty. So it's a mixed bag. But then suddenly also, it became clear also that this was not really a very resilient system. So the financial crisis, that was long overdue. There were 500 smaller crises before that in the finance world, from banking crisis, the peso crisis, to the ruble crisis, whatever. And nobody seemed to pay attention that also referred to as systemic origins, the root cause of the problem. Unfortunately, the financial crisis didn't bring us the insights that and you talk about the moment of reckoning, that really helped us to understand as a global community that we should come up with a different approach, because actually the financial crisis has never been resolved. The debt that we have as a global community on the government side, on the civil side, on the company side is huge. It's bigger than ever. So we didn't learn that much. We had some sort of band-aid then introduced in terms of stress tests and the like, but not really. And we sort of started now, so the Corona crisis now is yet another sort of indication that the system is not resilient. And I can tell you a lot about the resilience of the system in terms also of global value chains, about just-in-time delivery. We make ourselves very vulnerable to all sorts of systemic problems, but we also make ourselves very vulnerable of disruptive events. And of course now it is Corona, which actually is of course a sign of unresilient health system on a global scale. Speculation on all sides, including also from the companies, the pharmaceutical companies, but also including governments, like in the United States, for instance, that didn't develop a health system that was shared. And of course, the pre-existing conditions of many people in that system, actually on the global scale, you can see it easily, where the coronavirus probably will even hit harder in the next couple of months. So in that sense, it's relatively easy to analyze where this crisis will hit hardest. As Jim also said, it's a very unequal burden that is put on the people that suffer the most. And my unfortunate take on this is that if we didn't learn from the financial crisis, it might also have the same problem that we don't learn from this health crisis. So in a sense, I'm very mixed in this, because if, for instance, say next month we would have a vaccine, then that sort of would be sort of the band-aid that the financial crisis brought. We cover a little bit up and then everything will go well. And I'm mixed, of course, because I want to have the vaccine. On the other hand, I really want us to learn from this crisis. And I would say the yeah, if we can then learn also that it's what I started to say also, this is a governance crisis also, it's a setup crisis. And then, by the way, I come to part of the answer also. It's a wicked problem. We don't have answers, but we have directions of answers. And for me, one of the most important frameworks of governance, as I also refer to this hybrid governance, are the Sustainable Development Goals, actually. It's a rare occasion that in 2015, somewhere we defined 2030 aims, including health, including also all the issues that we face now. And I fully agree with the UN, by the way, that just issued the statement that if we would have been really making progress with the Sustainable Development Goals, you can already hear that I'm a bit critical about that, we would have been much more resilient also in answering to this crisis. We're not. So let's hope that we can learn from this, again, that it's not health, it's not finance, it is the system that relates also to poverty and all the other issues that we face.
Thanks very much, Robin. That point about that certain kinds of change aren't inevitable. They don't just naturally sort of come about, no matter how stark the crisis and how obvious the need for the change seems to be. So just on that, Barbara, I'm wondering if I'd come to you next, just to kind of deepen our reflections on the state of play before the crisis hit, and therefore maybe what it's telling us about how it's hitting. I was just wondering if you'd reflect a little bit for us about maybe some of that lack of preparation or what wasn't happening, if you like, in the run up to this crisis.
Yeah, I'll try to do that. I want to talk more generally about partnerships not being a panacea. I mean, we haven't, in this conversation yet, we haven't put out partnerships as the save-all, but we had that conversation when we were preparing. So my remarks are really counter to what I've been preaching for the last 25, 30, 40 years. But I really want to talk about power disparities and the inability of systems to be able to prepare adequately for such a crisis. So I went back to Hurricane Katrina in the US. And, I had a cartoon in my collection of cartoons of President Bush and the mayor from New Orleans, and then someone from the state level, I've forgotten, must have been the governor, their pictures, and then, failed collaboration underneath it. And I wanted to dig in more to understand what went wrong there. And there's a really nice case study that someone has written about it, and by Moynihan. And basically they said it's a failure of collaboration. And they pointed to two federal government agencies that after 9/11, so here's another crisis that we didn't learn from 9/11, basically we stripped FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, of all kinds of resources and deposited it underneath another agency, the Department of Homeland Security. So the structure of FEMA was actually eviscerated to some extent in its capabilities. And then we, in Katrina, brought in multiple federal agencies, all of whom were basically trying to call the shots. There were 3 different leaders trying to call the shots in the middle of this crisis while people were, standing on top of their rooftops wondering when they were going to be rescued. And ultimately, the Department of Defense won out after it came in the game late. But interestingly, they didn't have any sense of how to collaborate. The Department of Defense is a very top-down, authoritarian organization, and it didn't know how to work with anyone else, even though it had managed to become the person who was calling the shots. So I want to talk about our ability now, or when we're learning, as Rob said, if we learn from this crisis, about a framework for how we think about collaboration and whether or not it's possible to even embed that. So, I live in a fairly Trumpian section of Pennsylvania where people will not wear masks. So I'm rather pessimistic about whether or not we're learning anything from this crisis, If people can't even think about their neighbor and collaborate with their neighbor, around the protection of their health in the near term, how are we going to imagine a worldwide system that will allow us to collaborate effectively, let alone manage the disparities that some people have to carry, the inequities that come? So that's yet another point I'll raise later if we have time.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Thanks very much. And yeah, there's questions coming through in the chat about maybe even as May was asking, that in some senses cross-sector collaboration could slow things down if we need to do things quickly, or or what would be the trade-off of that, the time taken to form the kind of collaborations that everybody's been talking so much about today, that often do take quite a long time, and that kind of what kind of collaboration might we need. Sandra, just on that point, I'm wondering if you could share with us something of your insights about the kind of collaborative efforts that might be emerging, or that could be, or what we might need if we like to kind of give birth to the type of change that is potentially possible, but not naturally occurring.
No, by no means guaranteed, obviously. So I agree with Barbara, things are pretty dire, particularly here in the United States. And yet at the same time, I'm working with a couple of different initiatives that are attempting to do things a little bit differently. And so it's collaboration, but it's very different from the kinds of sort of, I will say, limited scale collaborations that we're used to, even when they're multi-stakeholder collaborations. We need to generate, and there are a number of initiatives that I know of that are trying to generate movements, networks, new types of organizations that connect, cohere, and amplify what Paul Hawken in 2007 called the blessed unrest of these 1 million to 2 million fragmented initiatives that are all trying to bring about a better world, socially just and more sustainable, is how he lumped it together. And we're calling these new economies, or transformation systems, and they include activists, peacemakers, people who we call warriors, like the Extinction Rebellion group, social entrepreneurs, people-centered economics initiatives, some policymakers, a few, not even here in the United States, there are a couple, people who are prophets and futurists, and they're all doing different types of work today than was conceivable back in 2007 for a number of reasons. One is because this pandemic did hit globally and it's mobilized a lot of people. Two is because there are technological means that people can connect across many different regions now that didn't exist 15, 20 years ago. And also because there is a lot of anger in the system, and people have now begun, all the protests last year recognized that inequity. That was exactly, if you go to the core of what people were protesting about anywhere, it's about inequality. And so those kinds of things are enabling people who are formerly marginalized to develop things in new ways. And so when I'm working with a group called the SDG Transformations Forum, which is really about generating theories about transformation, how system transformation takes place, and the kinds of experimentation and embeddedness and wicked complexity that all of this takes place in. And I just want to acknowledge Lita's talk a little earlier, I don't know if she's still here, but talking about brokers. And in a sense, these transformation catalysts are a form of brokers, but they're a different type of broker with a different kind of orientation to them. This idea builds on something that I wrote about back in when I was a young faculty member. That was a long time ago, we won't say how long, but it may be some of the work, if you're familiar with any of my work, that you are familiar with. When Jim Post and I wrote about transformation, catalytic alliances, these are modern day versions of those, and they have a different orientation. We're calling them, Steve Waddell and I in a paper we've written together are calling them transformation catalysts. And these catalysts work catalytically by weaving together and cohering and amplifying existing and emerging transformation efforts to cohere what Paul Hawken called that blessed unrest. And we're hoping to attempt to do this on a global scale, and what we're calling cosmolocally, cosmopolitan to local levels. So a cosmopolitan or global perspective, but taken down to the local level. Not that we will do anything, but we will bring them together in conversation so that they can emerge what is necessary for their contextually specific either issue or sector or issue sectors or place or geographic region. They tend to be right now. There's a lot of this stuff happening. It's self-organized, it's self-governing, it's bottoms up for the most part. It's not policy driven, even though there's recognition at some policy levels that change needs to happen. The idea is to create what we call transformation systems out of these now fragmented initiatives by bringing them together into collaborative conversations and dialogical processes where they themselves can see where the connections need to be made, where the power of doing work collaboratively might be, where unnecessary duplication is happening, and where there are big gaps that need to be filled, and begin to evolve in a sort of an evolutionary way and co-creatively with themselves, and facilitated by hopefully a platform that brings them together. Now, we're not the only one doing that. There's an organization called Catalyst 2030 that is all of these are brand new, that has just evolved to bring together social entrepreneurs. The We All Wellbeing Economy Alliance has been trying to do this for Next Economy or new economics initiatives over the past 2 or 3 years. There's a group called the Sustainable Energy for All, C4All Alliance. There's another group called the 1,000 Landscapes. In agriculture, there's something called at the Epicenter, which is actually happening in the U.S. So there are others that I could name, but I don't have them on my list here, so I've forgotten them all. And if there's time, I'll talk a little bit more later about the characteristics. I'm happy to talk with anybody offline about what we're seeing here. So let me turn it over.
Fascinating, Sandra. Yes, I am very interested in that kind of cosmo-local perspective, and I think it speaks it articulates nicely the thematic of the conference as well, in terms of being absolutely situated and responses coming from that local region, and yet somehow connecting to others who are also addressing similar issues and somehow sharing knowledge. So I definitely like to talk to you more on those. And just to come to Jim again, we were thinking about in our planning, because there's people are asking about, I suppose, the partnerships and the collaborations. I suppose as we know them already, whether they can be enabler of change or are they getting in the way, I suppose. But I wanted to ask you specifically, Jim, about what you think it is. How is the crisis really challenging and confronting particular aspects of what we know about partnerships? What is it unsettling about our knowledge about partnerships, and in what ways?
So my impressionistic take from scanning reported partnering descriptions is that collaborations during this particular time of crisis have proliferated. And it's making, and they're making important contributions toward dealing with multiple dimensions of the pandemic. Not to say that they're solving everything, they're not, obviously. And Barbara's point of being a little despondent, I appreciate that. There's plenty to worry about. But I think it does present us with a significant opportunity for research and learning on collaboration processes and their dynamics. So let me just share some thoughts on possible research issues and questions on how collaborations may be different and may merit further scrutiny because of these differences. Let me offer, and let's consider 10 collaboration variables, things that we've looked at throughout our time of studying partnering. First, barriers. The barriers to collaboration, you know, they're similar, but the motivation to overcome them is greater. Goal congruency is easier. It's the unifying force of a pandemic. There's a common threat to all. Necessity is the mother of collaboration. So addressing societal needs, in fact, in many instances we see are trumping the profit maximization. Second, time frame. The urgency of the crisis accelerates the partnering processes, and there may be lessons on how to mobilize rapid collaboration. Third, partner identification. There is a more proactive search process for partners because bottleneck variables in the systems and supply chains, they reveal potential partners. And networking, it seems, is becoming a key process mechanism for identifying possible collaborators. Fourth, risk-taking. There is a greater propensity to take risk, I think. For example, gearing up to produce without contracts or certainty of product viability and even remuneration. That's happening. And trust seems to emerge as a vital risk reducing enabler to create new collaborative networks. Fifth, removing information bottlenecks. Open sourcing has emerged to address serious knowledge gaps. Sharing was more important than taking credit. One chap observed, business guy, there is no time for trade secrets in a health crisis, especially when everyone is a stakeholder. 6, public-private partnerships emerging at all levels. So mobilizing resource complementarity across all sectors and levels really has clearly is essential for effective crisis response. And where that has been present, results were much better, and vice versa. Community level collaborations emerged. They became significant contributors, even at the micro level of collaborating, assisting neighbors in need, including frontline workers. And then at the global level, we've seen collaborations emerging, particularly for developing and manufacturing and distributing vaccines. They're still in process. We'll have to see how they unfold, but it's occurred. 7th, innovation. This has emerged as a focal point of collaboration. I mean, the imperative for a solution induces innovation. For example, there was one little example, a far-flung collaboration of scientists, engineers, physicians, and regulatory experts joined together to create a ventilator in 1 month. That would have normally taken a year or more to happen. There's repurposing going on as a form of innovation, leveraging current capabilities to produce different products, distilleries producing sanitizers, fashion companies making masks. So we have different forms of collaborative innovation. 8, the need for systemic and holistic approach that Rob and Sandra both pointed out. So where did collaborations emerge given the many need dimensions in a pandemic? There's so many points that could be researched. Was it detection, prevention, treatment, contact tracing, cures? For whom? At what levels? With what type of resources? Lots of different dimensions for examining. 9, durability. How durable are pandemic collaborations? Episodic collaboration clearly have arisen to meet the crisis. But can that cooperation be extended? Will partners discover new capabilities, develop new personal relationships, envision new opportunities to continue collaborating? So there's a need for prospective longitudinal studies of crisis-induced collaborations. And then 10th, lastly, not surprisingly, I've been looking at pandemic collaborations through the prism of the collaboration continuum. So philanthropic collaborations have been salient with a focus on key needed groups, frontline health workers, giving them protection, comfort, support, economically distressed folks, basic needs, food. And this is common in a natural, all natural disasters. Go to transactional collaborations. And what you see, they have emerged as removers of critical bottlenecks in the supply chain, with resource complementarity being perhaps the key collaboration enabler. Integrative collaborations. Some of these materialize almost instantaneously rather than the more common evolutionary process. For example, there have been some organizational fusions that have happened to find vaccines and prepare for manufacture. Interesting question is, do existing or have existing integrative collaborations repurposed their ability to collaborate together and focused on the pandemic? Worth trying to find out. Transformative collaborations, it's the fourth stage. Pandemic, it's revealed the system weaknesses more clearly, and it points to ways to address them. And that's what Rob and Sandra and Barbara have all pointed in that direction. So we have before us a panoply of collaboration configurations and dynamics, and they're just urgently awaiting our scrutiny. So onward, friends, let's get on with the research. There's a lot to do.
And a lot. We're not ready to leave yet. We have more time for discussion. But Jim, that was amazing. Thank you so much. What a pathway that you've put out for us for such a rich stream of research that would keep anyone for their whole career. So maybe some kind of collective action can occur, and we can kind of get to these questions as a community, which I think you've really laid it clearly out for us. But I wanted to come back. There's a really interesting question that came from Sitsa on which really speaks to how the crisis is also reconfiguring the actors that we're talking about when we talk about cross-sector interactions, the state, the non-profit, our civil society, and private sector. And in a way, each of these have been repurposed, if you like, to come back to your thought there, Jim. And the state has revealed itself as a really important actor in a different way before, maybe where we would have seen the private sector leading in a lot of things in the past. The state is taking on a role now, or a return to a role it had before. I'm wondering if I could add to that question, and maybe to come back to Barbara's point that she was making earlier around inequalities. And I suppose we rely on the state sometimes to in a functioning state as we might like it, or maybe in a social democratic state, to identify inequalities and organize for them, if you like. But I just wonder if we come back to you, Barbara, in my convoluted way, about your thoughts on these kind of reorganizing of these key actors that are of interest to us, the growing role of the state. But if you could reflect on that through your particular concerns around inequalities.
First of all, as Jim was speaking, I kind of wanted to say, what country are you living in? I think we're in the same country, and I'm looking at the bottom side of things, and you're looking at the opportunity side. So let me just make that note. I don't see the state acting in a very constructive way in the country that I live in. In fact, I won't go there, but just to make that point, we do not have the Defense Production Act brought in to help facilitate these production of masks and PPP and respirators and the things that were necessary. We had hospitals competing with each other in the market to get them and paying exorbitant prices for them. So, there's a flip side. Some people are being entrepreneurial and making collaborations, and they have the resources to do that. But I just saw on the TV the other night a woman who is in Philadelphia, who's small Black business was basically looted and destroyed, and wondering whether she's going to be able to put the resources together to continue. And so I think we have to look at some of the systemic embedded imbalances in our systems that did not have an opportunity to take advantage in the way that you have very, lovely, in a very, I think, intellectual way described for us, Jim. And Sandra too, because I think that if we look at some of our own literature, I went back and looked at the research on that Greta Schouten and Peter Glasberg, and one of our Lifetime Achievement Award winners also, has done. Pat Bergen, Wittenberg, a team led by Riesgaard and all. And they've looked at these transnational certification schemes that have taken years to construct. So can we collaborate? These things have taken years to construct, and they've begun to investigate the on-the-ground impacts. These were supposed to be partnerships among smallholder farmers at the lowest level in terms of local, and highest level businesses, countries who wanted to work together to put these sustainability certifications in place. Who is taking it on the chin? The smallholder farmers. Who is not profiting from those partnerships when these studies, and these are studies that have been done by our colleagues and others in economics as well. The smallholder farmers aren't included in the discussions because they can't leave their land and go join a conversation in Rome or Geneva or somewhere else. So they're not in the process, and for process efficiency, they haven't been included. The disparate costs are borne on their shoulders because they can't make a better living making a slight profit from the product that's now certified, that they could sell lots of their other product at a lower price and still make a better profit. They can't take the time to start learning the certification standards. They can't take the time because they have to get their product out. They have to be on the ground. The auditing discouraged them from learning and building these new skills, taking them on. And the sustainable quality decreased when they started to scale up these efforts. So I think if we look at what our own colleagues have been telling us about one type of partnership that goes local to global, there are some significant deficits in our ability to collaborate. So my questions, I'll add these to Jim's list of long, wonderful questions. How do political dynamics magnify or even scuttle well-intended efforts to collaborate? When partnerships create new institutional arrangements within a field, who bears the lion's share of the costs? And how does this affect the extant power among the partnership stakeholders? This is still an open question for people of color in our country and around the world. Right now they have a voice, so that first criteria is checked off, but for how long and in what corridors? When they start speaking to Congress, stuff is stalling, the policies aren't coming forward. I've lived too long. I've lived through the second wave of racial unrest in our country, the time when I was active in those things on the streets was many, many years ago. And I participated in many ways in my own life in trying to change, both educationally, filing lawsuits to prevent redlining, going out and working with realtors to test if they were really using the same criteria to show houses to whites and blacks. My sensitivities have been dulled a little bit, and my enthusiasm has been dulled when I look at it through this lens of inequality. So another question for us as researchers is how can we redistribute the unintended costs that are routinely borne by the poorest people, the least powerful partners of transnational standard setting partnerships or any other kinds of partnerships, so that net power disparities are reduced rather than increased? And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much. And I think when we look at these questions together, or they can, you know, they offer light to the other ones as well. I think it's really important that we keep these kind of things in relation to one another. Thank you so much. So Rob, just to come back to you again, partly back to the maybe the state question, because I suppose maybe in the Netherlands and other places in Europe, the state role has, you know, very much come closer. But also maybe in terms of whose role it is to realize, or who should be initiating the action to realize some of the changes that we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Annmarie. When Jim was talking, I was inclined also to add more points to the list, but 10 points is, of course, a perfect, in a Western view, a perfect number of points. However, getting back to your point, and also the question of Sietse and others, or the role of the state, actually, I want to make it a little bit more fundamental, because we have to look at the role of the state, but also the role of civil society, communities, and the role of the market players. What I see, there's no lack of attention to the idea that you want to collaborate whenever. However, there's an immense gap in terms of institutions, but also in terms of knowledge, how to make that work. And not a little bit, I call that the performance-driven school, that you say, okay, I make it a little bit more efficient. I start with a philanthropic partnership and make it a little bit more transactional or whatever. But really, that you link it to the issue at stake. In this case, it requires transformational partnerships. So in that sense, I'm really worried also that we spend a lot of energy also as scholars, but also as society, to invest in the partnerships that look nice, but are actually, I'm not going to say a waste of time, but nevertheless not really linked to the issue. So I see thousands of partnerships that I would not consider to be a partnership, or I see thousands of initiatives where I see companies, and we talk to many of them, but also governments, not really taking up the role of partnering. So in that sense also, for me, partnering for the government, so that relates also to the question of should we not reinvent or bring the state back in? I think yes, but not the state, say, in any sort of top-down approach, but actually the state in its basic role as the guardian of collective goods. And then in its secondary role, in terms of, this is mandating and this is facilitating role, but in endorsing and partnering, and then reinforcing that role where they're good, collective action, collective good provision, and then using partners as an addition to solve all the other common pool problems. And the same is true for companies. I don't like, really, I look at companies, I see them partner, but they then link it to the CSR department or the philanthropy department, whereas actually they should try to link it to their core business. But not as a compromise, but actually as a new way of innovative, new ways of organizing business. And the same is true for civil society as the three most important parts of society. I see too many civil society organizations also, say, entering into a partnership with a company, just basically go there for the money. From the premise also that they think that they do well intrinsically, whereas I think many of the civil society organizations that we've seen today, also the more institutionalized one on a global scale, I'm not that sure that they are effective and that they are efficient and that they actually represent the citizens they are supposed to represent. And there are so many examples of that also of international NGOs that are there. So for me, the partnership approach here is that everybody should think about their basic roles. So the core business, call it the resource base or whatever, the basic capabilities. Everybody should think of how the approach, the problem that we face, that's COVID now, of course. They are systemic, and they require transformational partnerships. And we should not be content, even as scholars also, to study partnership that try to solve it a little bit. I think we really should be very careful not to also be part of the problem by helping good-willing partners to improve it a little bit or make it a little bit less worse, but really fundamentally look at how we can link those partners also to the aim. And that's also why I like so much the Sustainable Development Goals, not because I'm an ideologue for the Sustainable Development Goal, but actually they portray a goal. So this is a goal-setting institution effort. We don't know how to approach it. There are 1,000 different ways. But anyway, in that agenda, it's very clear that it is acknowledged that nobody can do it on their own. everybody should partner one way or another. It's part of the 5 P's: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnering as the core principles of this agenda. For me, that's highly inspirational on the one hand, but also gives us a lot of sort of leeway with companies, governments, and civil society organizations to help them in that agenda, and hopefully not help them to do it a little bit, because I fear very much the process of what I call in this context SDG washing. It's like greenwashing. You try to do it a little bit, you put it in the sticker, you have a brochure, a website, and whatever. And 5 years later, we come to the, maybe also on the basis of scientific research, maybe Barbara also referring to some of these certification schemes, and then we say, well, actually, it had the opposite effects. And I don't think we can wait for 5 years now as scholars to look at this and then say, well, we write a scientific article on this, basically it failed. Because unfortunately, I fear personally as a scholar that we will fail as a society, and yeah, the consequences are quite urgent.
Thanks, Rob. Sandra, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, so I want to respond to what everybody's been saying, because, especially Barbara, I think. Yeah, our federal government is a miserable failure. I couldn't agree more. But if you look at where change is happening, it's often happening at the local level and coming up from the bottom. So there is stuff happening. It's just not happening in this ridiculous government that we have. But it won't happen on its own. It's not going to just happen. That's where facilitation comes in. And this is not about doing scholarship and going off and, you know, studying something that someone else is doing and writing a paper about it that comes out 5 years later in some journal that is behind a paywall that people most around the world can't read. It's about doing action research. It's about getting, which I know Barbara and Dave and others of us have been doing for a long time. It's about getting out there and being willing to put yourself on the line. It's about becoming involved with people who are really different from you, come with incredibly different perspectives, and having to work with them in wholly new ways. And the old ways, the certification programs and all the stuff that I was so hopeful about in 2008 when I wrote my paper on infrastructure, the CSR infrastructure, that is not going to get us where we need to go. We need new approaches. We need new ways of doing things. We need to bring together people who have not been heard, the marginalized, the poor, the indigenous folks, the youth. And we need to find ways of hearing them in these initiatives. And that's what this idea of the transformation catalyst is about. It's about bringing those voices together. Not so that, and what I had an insight when I think it was when Jim was talking, is that the original work on public-private partnerships, which was my dissertation work, that was very top-down. That assumed that government and some people in civil society organizations and these big businesses had the answers, and then by getting them together, that was going to happen. That is not what's happened, and that's what Barbara's pointing us to, I think, is that, you know, if we're looking to our leaders for leadership, it ain't there. And so we better be looking elsewhere, and that is to us and to our people around us and to people whose voices need to be heard, because there is huge wisdom there. They know what is needed, and that is the wisdom that can be brought out in these new transformations, but it will not happen on its own. It needs to be facilitated. People need to be brought together. They need to be put into what we're calling, for the sake of a better word, transformation systems. Systems that bring together the actors who are trying to change these systems so that they can cohere, connect with each other, and amplify their effectiveness. Because I can tell you that right now in Washington, the powers that be are meeting in back rooms trying to bring back the system, bounce back to the system that existed before the pandemic happened as much as possible, which probably won't be fully possible because of complexity, but they're trying to bring it back as much as possible. Why? Because power and money are involved in it. And the only way that that's going to change is through the there's lots of kinds of actions, but one of the kinds of actions is sort of what Steve Waddock calls the warrior strategy of all these protests that we've been seeing. But there's other collaborative strategies that need to be alongside of the warrior strategies, because warrior is about breaking down whereas the collaborative strategies are about building up and finding something new. And it isn't going to be done with certification schemes. It isn't going to be done with the old ways of getting big government and big business and big NGOs together. It needs to be a very different type of process, and there is no roadmap for this. There's no literature out there that says how to do this, because it's happening now. It's happening in real time, and it's happening with tons of people around the world. And do we have a chance? Who knows? You know, the IPCC report tells us we have 10 years. It may not be effective, but boy, if we don't take that kind of action now as scholars, and there's plenty of stuff to investigate there, as Jim pointed us towards, plenty of ways to get involved in these kinds of activities, but it's going to force you into new ways of being in that situation, because you can't sit and observe it. You have to be part of it. You have to be active in it in some very different way than is possible. So I probably said more than I needed to.
That's wonderful. Sandra, thank you so much. And thank you to the panelists. I think it has been such a rich discussion. We have research agendas and thought-provoking questions to ask ourselves as researchers, and it not only a call to action, but in a sense a call to activism, and how we might act to bring about the kind of changes, and not just speak from the sidelines and observe. And it was absolutely wonderful to hear you speak. There was a very rich discussion in the chat. We're saving that. We're going to disseminate that somehow. This recording will be shared. And I hope people will continue the discussions, either find each other one-to-one to continue a conversation. We're going to have another social chat this evening after our short music break from Emma Langford again. So there's more time to talk and allow these ideas to evolve out more. It's been absolutely amazing. We have to close this session now, because I'm going to give a short wrap up for the day, and there's been some important things just to reflect on, and Leah Statler is going to reflect on some of the partnership brokering stuff as well. So there's stuff happening in the next room, so if you could all get along to there as soon as you can. But on behalf of everyone, thank you so much to the panelists for your such rich and thoughtful insights. Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was amazing.